Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring the Dhamma and the Real World, a fascinating book by Ajahn Pasanno and Ajahn.
Yeah, it's the good one.
We're going to see how these Buddhist teachings can actually give us some pretty practical advice, for dealing with all the stuff life throws at us, and who knows, maybe even make a difference in the world while we're at it.
What I find really interesting about this book is how it kind of tackles head on this idea that, ancient wisdom can still be super relevant to our lives today.
Totally. It's funny though, because I think when a lot of people hear Buddhist monks, they picture like this ivory tower, right? Like what could they possibly know about the everyday struggles of like paying bills or dealing with difficult coworkers? But Ajahn really dives right into that assumption in a way that I wasn't expecting.
Yeah, there's this common misconception that monasteries are these like peaceful havens completely cut off from all the chaos of, real life.
Right, right.
But Ajahn actually argues that monasteries are like these microcosms of real life, just stripped down to the bare essentials.
Okay, I have to admit, when I first read that, I was like, hold on, how can a monastery possibly reflect the craziness of my daily grind? So help me understand that.
Well, think of it this way. What actually defines real life? It's not really about our jobs or the stuff we own. It's about those universal human experiences. The raw emotions, the thoughts that just won't quit, all the challenges and joys that come with being human.
Okay, yeah.
And those things, they don't magically disappear when you walk into a monastery.
If anything, you're saying it might even be more intense because you don't have all the usual distractions.
Exactly. And that's where it gets really interesting. Ajahn uses this really powerful analogy of the junkie to describe how attached we are to external things, like our possessions, relationships, even our own opinions.
Oh, yeah. That analogy really stuck with me, too. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Here. So as long as we have those external fixes, we might feel okay, maybe even content. But take those away, and suddenly, bam, all those raw emotions, all those automatic reactions we have, they come bubbling right up to the surface. And that's what monastic life encourages, according to Ajahn.
So it's like forcing us to confront all that stuff we usually try to avoid.
Exactly. It's about stripping away those crutches so we can really see ourselves, see our patterns more clearly.
It's like ripping off a Band-Aid, right? Instead of just slapping another one on top, you've got to expose the wound to let it heal properly.
That's a great way to put it. And by facing those raw emotions head on, without all the distractions, we cultivate a resilience and inner strength.
Which reminds me of that story you mentioned about the nun who said that giving up her opinions was actually harder than all the physical adjustments of monastic life.
Yes. That story really highlights how tightly we cling to our ideas of how things should be, right?
It's like my way or the highway, even if that highway leads to a whole lot of unnecessary stress.
Exactly. We're so attached to being right that it creates a whole other layer of suffering.
Yeah.
But when we cultivate mindfulness, when we can just observe those thoughts and judgments without getting totally swept away by them, it creates space. Space to navigate those everyday frustrations with a little more grace. Maybe even some humor, right?
It's funny how we tend to think about inner work and taking action as these separate things.
Yeah, like they're two totally different worlds.
Right. But Ajahn Pasanno really connects those dots in a way that really got me thinking.
Totally. He has this really expansive view of what social action even means. It's not just about like grand gestures, or being a full-time activist.
So it's more about our everyday interactions.
Yeah. It's like any interaction we have that impacts another person, no matter how small.
So even those little things like telling someone to have a good day or giving a coworker a hand with something, those all count.
Totally. It's about recognizing that everything's connected. Our actions have these ripple effects, even when we think we're just doing our own thing.
It's like that butterfly effect thing.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do we even begin to be more conscious of those ripples? Where do we start?
Well, Ajahn Pasanno points to these three pillars of Buddhist training: Sīla, Samādhi, and Paññā.
Okay, see, now you're using these terms again, and I gotta be honest, I'm not totally fluent in Buddhist terminology quite yet.
Oh, right.
Could you give me a little refresher on those?
Of course. So Sīla is often translated as virtue or ethical conduct. Basically, it's about making sure our actions are in line with our values, doing our best to act in ways that are skillful and beneficial.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But how does that connect to social action? Like, I think a lot of people see things like the precepts not stealing, not lying as like purely personal, almost like a private morality code.
Right, and it's easy to fall into that trap of, Well, as long as I'm not hurting anyone, it's all good. But the real power of the precepts is that they help us think about the impact of our actions on others. It's not just about being good in some abstract sense.
It's about how our behavior actually affects the people around us.
Yes, exactly. And it's not just about those outward actions either. Ajahn Pasanno also talks about cultivating these inner qualities, the Brahma Vihāras, remember those?
Right, those divine abodes, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. Those sound great and all, but do they really have a place in our crazy competitive world?
I think they're more important than ever. Think about it, a society that's full of loving kindness, where people genuinely feel joy for each other's success. They can handle challenges with a sense of calm.
Yeah.
It's totally different from what we usually see, right?
100%. Okay, but how do we actually cultivate those qualities? Especially when the world can feel so opposite. I mean, it's easy to talk about compassion when things are going great. But what about when we're dealing with difficult people or just having a really bad day?
Well, that's where the real work comes in, right? And that's where those first two pillars, Sīla and Samādhi, are so important. Ethical conduct, that commitment to acting skillfully, that's the foundation.
Okay.
And then Samādhi, which is often translated as meditation or concentration, that allows us to actually see our patterns, those automatic reactions like anger or judgment. And it gives us a chance to make a different choice.
So it's like we're building the support from the inside out so we can actually handle those big ideals.
Exactly. And it's not about being perfectly enlightened before we can even engage with the world,
Right. It's a process.
Yes. It's about understanding that even making an effort to cultivate those inner qualities, even if it's just little by little, that it has a ripple effect. We might not be able to single-handedly solve climate change, but we can approach our everyday lives with a little more kindness.
And those little acts of kindness can inspire other people to do the same.
Precisely.
Speaking of ripple effects,
Yeah.
I love how both Ajahn Amaro and Ajahn Pasanno give these real-world examples, like Ajahn Pasanno's work with protecting the forests in Thailand. That one really resonated with me.
Yeah, that's a powerful example of how crucial it is to understand the root of suffering. Instead of just condemning the loggers for destroying the forest, he took a step back.
He asked why.
Exactly. What's motivating them to do this?
Which is such an important question. It's so easy to get stuck in that us versus them mentality.
Totally. But it's usually way more complicated than that.
So what did he do?
Well, Ajahn Pasanno realized that the loggers were just trying to provide for their families. It wasn't that they were bad people.
They were just trying to survive.
Exactly. And a lot of systems kind of pit economic needs against environmental well-being, right?
Right.
So instead of judging them, he tried to understand them. And that allowed him to find a solution that was both compassionate and effective.
What did he do?
He worked with the loggers to find other ways to make a living, ways they could support their families while also protecting the forest.
Wow. So it's about finding those win-win situations.
Exactly. And what I think is really cool is that he didn't just stop with the loggers. He realized that everyone involved, the merchants, the police, they were all part of a larger system.
It's like that saying, you can't solve a problem with the same thinking that created it.
Right. Sometimes those systems need a little shaking up, but that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, it really makes you realize that, patience is key here. It's not going to happen instantly.
No.
And speaking of bringing these principles down to earth, what about Ajahn Amaro's insights on, applying this stuff to family life?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, talk about a training ground, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, forget about saving the rainforest.
Right.
Can I just, make it to bedtime without,
losing it.
Yeah. But, one of the things that I think he really emphasizes how important it is for us to, recognize our own expectations as parents. How much of the suffering that we experience is because we have this idea of how we think things should be.
Right. Like how our kids should act, what kind of parent we should be.
100%. And those expectations, a lot of times we don't even realize we have them.
Right.
But they can cause so much unnecessary suffering for us and for our kids.
It's like that expectation versus reality meme, but with the people we love the most.
Yeah. And it's not about blaming ourselves for having those expectations.
Yeah.
We all have them. It's more about, can we just see them, question them?
Yeah.
And then hopefully create some space for our kids to just be who they are.
Right. Not who we think they should be.
Exactly. And, I love that he talks about using stories as a way to kind of introduce some of these Buddhist ideas to kids.
Because let's be real, trying to explain impermanence to a 5-year-old?
Yeah, exactly.
But stories have this way of, like, sneaking past our rational minds, right?
You really do.
And speaking right to the heart. And I think what I really appreciate is that Ajahn Amaro, he doesn't shy away from, like, the heavier stuff, like death, disappointment, even in children's stories.
He doesn't sugarcoat it, does he?
Not at all. And I think that's important. It's like trying to protect kids from the realities of life, it's not doing them any favors.
It's true. It's like we're kind of setting them up to be shocked when they encounter those things.
Yeah. So it's about finding that balance.
For sure.
Meeting them where they're at with honesty, but also with compassion.
Right. And it's not just about the stories we tell them, right?
Right.
It's about us living it. Because kids are always watching. Oh, they're little sponges.
Yeah.
They pick up on everything. And even if we're telling them one thing, but like our actions are totally different.
Exactly.
They'll notice.
Actions speak louder than words.
100%. And that actually reminds me of something else Ajahn Amaro talks about, which is integrating mindfulness into like everyday family life. And I'm not even necessarily talking about like formal meditation practice.
Right.
Although that's great too. But just like those little moments throughout the day, where we can just like notice what's happening and choose a different way of responding.
Right. Like even in the midst of like a full-blown meltdown.
Exactly.
Like that saying, parenting is like the ultimate spiritual practice.
Oh, for sure.
Or maybe it's more like family life is the ultimate training for showing up in the world with more awareness, with more compassion.
Yes. And that brings us right back to that interconnectedness.
Right.
Like, it's not about waiting until we achieve some perfect state before we can engage with the world.
Right.
It's about taking those qualities of mindfulness, compassion, wisdom, and bringing them into everything we do.
It's like we're all works in progress.
Always.
And the more we can kind of embrace that, the more we can approach each other, approach ourselves with a little more grace, a little more understanding.
Yeah, and that's where those ripples of positive change start.
Exactly. It's not about being perfect. It's about the journey.
100%.
Wow. So much to think about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us, everyone. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, keep showing up as your best selves out there in the real world.